Linda, are you there?
I'm here.
Just got your message.
Well, we're set. Lan is going to do the plan of the month.
Oh, okay.
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 Okay. So, welcome everyone. I guess we have a little bit of news. The State Native Plant Society has hired an executive director to full-time work on our mission, and they will also be contracting a grant writer, so we should be looking to grow this year. Also, we've changed our policy on COVID, so now it is according to the CDC guidelines and applicable local guidelines. However, Lan has been taking advantage of these remote speakers to get people from far field, and I believe she has them picked through July. So we will continue being having these remote meetings. I guess now Lan is going to tell us about the plant of the month.
I think Andrew wants to make some announcements.
Andrew, okay.
Yes, just really quickly, everyone, I wanted to share. It was in our most recent newsletter, but in case you missed it, we just published our board and committee meeting calendar. And we also made it so that all of our board and committee meetings have the same Zoom link. I know we've been receiving some emails, people wanting to volunteer or get involved, but you know, we've been having trouble keeping up with all of the emails coming to the chapter account. So we are hoping that this standardized Zoom link and the calendar will help people who want to get involved. So that you can, you know, hop onto one of our board meetings, which are open to anyone. So I'm going to paste into the chat the link for the board meeting calendar and committee meeting calendar, as well as that Zoom link. So you can bookmark those if you'd like to attend one of those meetings with us. And we would love to have you. And now I'll turn it over to Lan.
Okay, I guess we start with plan of the month.
Yeah.
Okay. If you would get the slides for plan of the month.
Andrew, yeah, I can't share my screen.
Okay, our plant of the month this month is Baptisia Alba, or white wild indigo. It is a perennial, deep-rooted, about 2 to 4 feet tall, and it's in the bean family. And it's got a great shape. It's very erect. It's got erect spikes of flower, and it doesn't flop. So that's good. The species is a facultative upland plant native to grasslands in Central and Eastern North America. And the white pea-like flowers bloom between April, well, around here, probably around closer to April than July, and in erect clusters. It has velvety alternate leaves divided into 3 leaflets, and these leaflets are pointed at each end. And the leaves turn from bluish gray to black in the fall. The fruit is an oval pod with many seeds inside, and it ripens from the green color to black. The clusters of large black seed pods often remain attached to the stems, and then when the dry plants act as tumbleweeds, they'll bring along some of these plants, some of these pods. let's see. It's a beautiful plant. You can see it in Chambers County. I saw it in Chambers County once when we were looking for prairie remnants, and also during City Nature Challenge. So it blooms around April around here. It's when you see it in the wild in Chambers County, it's along the roadside. So the light requirement is full sun. Soil is acidic, but actually closer to neutral 7 because it's 6.8. So that's pretty close to 7. It's heat tolerant, and the soil is rocky or sandy, acidic soils. In Chambers County, we saw in the roadside close to the water, so it'll be sandy also. And it tolerates seasonal flooding. This plant has benefits to insects, and it's toxic to mammals. Being a legume, it puts nitrogen into the soil. Okay, many species of caterpillars eat the leaves. The caterpillars of the wild indigo, dusky wing, and orange sulfur. And despite the lack of floral scent, bumblebees love to visit the flower. The wild indigo weevil consume the plant, and their young live in the seed pods and eat the seeds. Now, I haven't collected the white indigo, but I'd love to. But I have collected the Baptisia, the yellow Baptisias that we have on our prairies. And sometimes when you get the seed pods, they'll have holes in them, and you open it up and the seeds would have been eaten by the weevils. Now, this plant is toxic to mammals. It has been fatal to cows and can be irritating to humans if ingested. Let's see. And here are some of the informational sources. Now, like I said, the plant is grows in the wild in Chambers County. If somebody lives in Chambers County and could let us know when the plant, when the seed pods form, so we can go collect it, that would be wonderful. The problem is, if you live far away, you can't really go collect it because it's on the roadside, and you go there estimating, you go there when you see it bloom, you estimate when it might be collectible, then you go there and it's been mowed. So we would love to have, if somebody lives in or travels to Chambers County, will let us know when to go and collect it. It's a beautiful plant. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is City Nature Challenge. Is there a slide for that also?
Yeah, just a second.
Okay.
Here we go. You see it?
Yes. All right. We did good. We are number 3 in the world for the number of species. Now, City Nature Challenge, as many of you know, they have 3 categories where that they do statistics, and it's cities around the world competing. The 3 categories are species observed, the number of observations made in the greater city area, and the number of observers that participated. And Houston, Galveston, greater Houston, Galveston, which is Houston and the surrounding counties, including like Brazoria, Fort Bend, etc., Chambers, that we rank number 3 in the world for the total number of species observed. That is fantastic. And we've always ranked high for number of species. We're number 1 in the US for the number of species observed. And in Texas, we beat Dallas for not only the number of species observed, but also the number of observers. And that might be either the first time or one of the few times we've beaten Dallas for a number of observers. So next year, come April, if you didn't participate this year, participate and help us increase our lead in various areas. So for those people that participated, congratulations. And for those people that did not participate, we'll see you next year. Okay, now let me introduce Minette Marr.
Yeah, let me get the other screen.
Okay.
Open up. Oh, I have to hit escape. Okay, here we go.
Okay. Our speaker tonight is Minette Marr of the Ladybird Wildflower Center. She will be talking to us tonight about the Public Garden Sustainability Index, one of the newer tools in the center's tool cart to teach about natives to Texas plants, biodiversity, and environmental sustainability. Now, I had heard of Minette before meeting her at a public event at the Wildflower Center several years ago. And at that event, when I asked her, I think she had a booth about milkweeds. So when I asked her, she taught me how to tell the difference between Asclepias viridis and Asclepias asperula, both of which look very similar and have common names of green milkweed and antelope horn. So they look pretty similar. On the left is the Asclepias viridis, and on the right is the asperula. And what she told me is that if you look at the knobs, whatever the scientific name, I don't know, the knobs on the viridis, it is sort of shorter than what the layman calls petals. I looked it up and that's called a horn. But anyway, so it is shorter than the so-called petals, whereas for the asperula, the knobs are about the same height as the petals. So that's one way. If you looked at two different plants, of course there are other things, but this is a good way to tell the difference. And so I'm passing on what she taught me. So more about Minette. Since participating in since participating in a wetlands restoration project in the headwaters of the San Marcos River 20 years ago, Minette has collaborated with landowners and volunteers to increase the availability of seeds for restoration and research projects. During the past 15 years, she has contributed to the Millennium Seed Bank Project, participated in the National Parks Inventory and Monitoring Program, and designed the Central Texas Milkweed Ecotypes Collecting Strategy. And about the Millennium Seed Bank, she went collecting with Pauline Singleton during the Millennium Seed Bank time, one of our members, Pauline Singleton. And when I heard about it, I was definitely envious. As a conservation botanist and research associate, Minette serves as a botanical lead for floristic surveys, coordinates site use by external researchers, curates the seed bank, and leads a fearless non-native plant eradication team. Yay, Minette, for leading the non-native plant eradication team. In her spare time, she participates in the iNaturalist community, and you can follow her floristic adventures at iNaturalist/people/bee blossom seeds. Actually, if you look at the chat near the beginning of the chat, I had typed it in. So that's her iNaturalist handle is bee blossom seeds. Minette, thank you for coming to speak to us.
You're welcome. I am glad to be here.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Is that got it? I think that has it. Well, thank you, Lynn, for the introduction. This is a very different presentation for me than any I have given previously, but I would like to look at sort of a new role that the Wildflower Center has, or new roles, and sort of a new tool that we have to evaluate what we are doing. And I think it is especially important because a lot of what the Public Garden Sustainability Index proposes would also be possible for each chapter of the Native Plant Society to consider when you're making decisions about what you want to do. So with that said, I will get started. And if anybody has a question, feel free to put it in the chat or wherever, and I will try to answer it. The presentation really has 3 parts, and I will stop between different sections. And so we won't get too far ahead at any point. All right. Most of you have been to the Wildflower Center, but a lot of the Wildflower Center is really not visited by the majority of the visitors. And so we have the central section of the Wildflower Center, and most people spend their time there. And then we have a family section to the north of that. And go back to that. The family section the family garden has just added so much to the Wildflower Center. You know, when we just have the central section, you having to tell kids, you know, don't run and don't pull the flowers and don't do this and don't do that. And so the family garden was a true, really a game changer for the Wildflower Center, because we had a lot of young families come out. There's a play lawn that the Temple family funded. And so there's just a lot to do. And then to the east, there is an arboretum. And that's a very peaceful place where you can go out and you can walk, and you have, you know, ADA paths and large oaks and swings and all those things. So those are sort of the 3 areas that most visitors are familiar with. But then the remainder of the 200 acres is in either just a natural area or in a research plot. And so if you've never visited the research plots, I would encourage you to do so the next time you come. There's a lot on our website about the research, and hopefully you'll have a little bit more before the night, so more of a sense about it. So in October of 2020, the Wildflower Center was recognized by the American Public Gardens Association for its work with biodiversity. And that was a real honor for us. And it highlighted things that had been done for the last 20 years. So I want to make sure you understand that I did not do all of this work. It was done by a lot of people, and many organizations helped. So what I want to do before I go any further is to acknowledge some of those people. So from the Wildflower Center, we had Flo Oxley, started the conservation program, Damon Waite, Michael Eason, Karen Clary, Andre DeLong Amaya, Hans Landl worked on the invasive program. Joe Marcus has tried to keep up with our records for us. And then Sean Watson and Susan Prosperi in the nursery were a huge help at times when we would get plants in as rescue plants, and we were trying to keep them alive until they could produce seed. And then in the research plots, we have 2 people who have done the vegetation surveys for 20 years now, Michelle Burleson and Dick Davis. And then we partnered with a lot of organizations, specifically Texas Parks and Wildlife, Jackie Poole, and now Anna Strom. They both, when they were monitoring rare plants all over Texas, they would say, this isn't a good year to make that collection, or it is a good year to make that collection. And so we always felt like we were making our seed collections at the best possible time. They also kept us informed about populations of rare plants that were in danger of destruction for whatever reason, either a road going through or change of land use, whatever. They would inform us of that so we could try to make plans as far in advance as possible. we had a huge project with the milkweeds, and I would like to say that Chris Best made a huge difference in that project for us. We weren't focused on rare milkweeds, but we were focused on the ecotypes of the 3 species that we know the monarchs use. And so that was a great project for us. A lot of times when we start trying to figure out where plants are, especially early on, we would go back and we would look to see where Bill Carr had seen those plants. And then Mercer Botanic Garden is really, to me, it's like our sister organization. We have backup collections of their rare seed collections, and they back up our seed collections. So for instance, in the case, if Mercer got flooded during one of those storms, hopefully the seeds in our collection would be the backup that we needed. And finally, one person that's made a huge difference has been the person that designed the wildflower license plates a long time ago. The funding that comes in from that helps fund the program. And then I cannot tell you how many private landowners we met with over the, just over the course of the last 20 years. We couldn't have done a project without them. And then literally hundreds of people who scouted and made seed collections or processed seeds here at the Wildflower Center. So what I'm talking about tonight, it was done by many people, and I'm probably forgotten somebody, but that you just need to know it's a big project. All right, so to the Public Gardens Sustainability Index, and this is available at www.publicgardens.org for any organization to use, and it is to inspire gardens to pursue sustainable goals and to partner with other groups to do that. As your NIPSOT chapter knows, and the NIPSOT chapters that I am familiar with here in Central Texas, sometimes we just take on more than we can sustain. And so we're trying to figure out what kinds of projects we can sustain and who we can work with so we don't let too much fall off the plate. There are 3 categories in the sustainability index, and then each category has 4 attributes. So the 3 categories are environmental, social, and economic. The Wildflower Center was awarded the Sustainability Award for one of the, or 2 actually, of the attributes under the environmental category. I am not the person to talk about the water quality and consumption attribute, but I can talk about the biodiversity. So that's what we'll focus on tonight. And we really have 2 sections to that. The in situ capacity, which is what is the plants that naturally occur on this site and in the immediate area, and the ex situ conservation capacity. So those are species that would not naturally occur here, but in some way the Wildflower Center contributes to their conservation. All right, so the benchmarks for in situ capacity, we do better on some of these than we do on others. We're always trying to improve. In some years, we work on some of these attributes and not others, or some of these benchmarks but not others. But it over the last 20 years, I think we have seen a lot of improvement in what we've done. So the first thing is we want to use science-based best practices. But I want to make sure that you understand that people are studying these things all the time. And so the science is changing in some ways. What we might have thought 20 years ago would be the best way to do things might not still apply. So whenever you're making a decision, try to look at information that is current. And I'll give you a good example of that toward the end of this presentation. But we are using science-based best practices. And we're trying to support the recovery of native species. And those are species, in our case, that tend to be on the Edwards Plateau or the Texas Blackland Prairie. Once we start focusing beyond that, say the Schwallen Desert or the Piney Woods, we're really not talking about what's native to our site, our ecoregion. We do try to manage invasive species in natural areas on site and the nursery, but there's a major group of areas in which we don't do that. And you will understand why in just a little bit. We monitor the areas impacted by in-situ activities. Some areas are monitored more frequently than other areas. For instance, right now, we have a major construction project going on the west side of the property as MOPAC is being expanded. So we are monitoring the invasion of species from that construction project because we don't want them to get into the research plots if we can help it at all. All right, and then we want to reintroduce native species that we feel like would have been here prior to some past land uses in which there were probably too many goats and cows on the site, and some species, some perennial wildflowers would have disappeared. The research indicates that. And then as a garden and a site, it's somewhat of a conundrum for us. We do tend to focus on our home ecoregions, but we also have a lot of plants from the Schwallen Desert. That is sort of slowly changing. I don't know what the future of that will be. And then our greatest weakness, as I see it, has been that we have not documented the provenance of plants as they have come in. I was relieved in a way to hear someone from the U.S. National Arboretum say that they looked at that, documenting the provenance of the plants in their arboretum as a project that would take 100 years. And so it took some of the pressure off of us here, but we are moving forward, trying to take that seriously. When we replace plants, we're trying to document that provenance if at all possible, or use a species for which we can do that. All right, so let's talk about on-site capacity. The two science-based practices that we use for seed collections are available online. We use the Seeds of Success protocol for common species. That is available at this website. It is the protocol that is used by the National Park Service, by the U.S. Forest Service. All of those different federal agencies use this protocol. In brief, you would want to collect seeds or fruit from a minimum of 50 plants in the population, and you would collect approximately the same number of seeds from each plant. All right, and then we use the Center for Plant Conservation protocol for rare species, and that is very different. Most of the time when I make a collection of a rare plant, of a rare species, I'm not finding 50 plants, but I still need to make a collection. And so what we do that's different with that is we collect fewer, and we don't ever want to collect more than 10% of the seeds that are available. And we don't want to return to the same site in the following year, or ideally within the following 10 years, unless that site that population is in danger of being extirpated. So very careful with how we make those seed collections for the rare species. Again, a little bit of another way to look at this, when we're using that Seeds of Success, we're collecting from 50 plants, and all the seeds of fruit go in one bag. And then if we're collecting seeds of a rare species, we're collecting what's available, less than 10%, and by seed parent. And that's pretty slow because you have the fruit from one plant and it goes in an envelope, its location and its number are documented, and then you start a new envelope with the next seed parent. And so it takes several pairs of hands to make those collections efficiently, and certainly to process them. I want to make a note here, just so you'll understand. On site, we do not collect seeds from the research plots because that would influence, that would change the nature of the research there. We don't want to do that. All right, another on-site capacity benchmark is that we support the recovery of rare native species that occur on-site or in the nearby area. To the best of my knowledge, the only truly rare species that we have on-site is plateau milkvine. It occurs in an area that is not under treatment. It is a woodland. It has more topographic relief than most of the areas that we have on site. And there are lots of plants there, but we will protect that, monitor it. We would love to have a graduate student or an intern do some work on that for us so we know more about it. We have other species that are very likely on site, but not as obvious as that one. Another on-site capacity benchmark is that you will obtain permits and follow the laws for any land management activities. The three that come to mind when I think about that are the prescribed burns, the impervious cover limits, and the invasive species removal on site. So when we're conducting prescribed burns, they require permits and area-wide coordination. Here you see someone from the City of Boston, Watershed Protection Division, and our land manager, and they are talking about a prescribed burn that is going to happen on site that day. And those teams, they work with each other all over this area. It's quite something to see. And then another thing that we really have to be careful about is protecting the Edwards Aquifer. And because we don't want to increase, we cannot increase the impervious cover here on site. And so that limits expanding trails and parking. If you've been on site before, you know that parking can be a real issue for us. In the last 5 years, if we look at the 5 years before the pandemic, our annual visitation more than doubled. And so we seriously are working on increasing parking, but we can't do so if it's going to impact the aquifer. And then when we treat invasive species, they're treated with the best practices. And when we're treating invasive species, for the most part, what we're really trying to do right now is not to let any new species get established on site. When a wildflower center was first established here, say 30 years ago, there were already a lot of invasive species. Bird clover, KR blue stem, Bermuda grass, those things. Those things are already part of our research areas, and we can't treat them because that's not part of that research. But what we can do is make sure that we don't allow new invasive species to get in the research areas. And so this is an example of the angled blue stem. It was observed on site by Dick Davis, our land steward. 12 plants were observed along a fence that had been newly constructed. And we got out there, well, I can't say we, he got out there once we got a positive identification on it and removed those. And then we go back by regularly and check to make sure that it has not come back up. Another species that we're doing a lot of work on to make sure it doesn't get into the research plots would be the Maltese star thistle. For the most part, the Maltese star thistle is limited to roadways and fence lines, and we're trying to remove that as fast as we can. All right, and then another on-site capacity benchmark is that you're going to monitor the areas in which you're doing any sort of activity. And this is one of the most special parts about the Wildflower Center is the vegetation in our research plots has been monitored for 20 years. There are 56 research plots. They average about 1.5 acres. There are 8 treatments, and it takes about 2 weeks or more, if the weather cooperates, for us to monitor all of them. And that's with a team of 6 surveyors. The teams include staff and trained volunteers. This picture was taken this last, I guess last month or so, when we were, the last 2 days we worked in the rain, but we got it done. Anyway, so an amazing amount of effort, but it represents a tremendous resource for research in Central Texas, that you have these plots that for 20 years have received different treatments. So there are plots that in which nothing has happened. Those are the control plots. And then if you think about the 3 seasons, excluding the spring, but there are summer burns and summer mows. There are fall burns, fall mows, winter burns and winter mows, and then there are frequent mows. And so after 20 years in those plots, you can really see differences. And a lot of the current research that is being done is not so much about the vegetation in the plots, but about the soil, how the soil has responded to those differences in treatment, and how the pollinators and other pollinators and microbes have responded. It's a tremendous resource. All right, and then the last one I would like to talk about is about on-site capacity to reintroduce native species. In 2019, a graduate student from Texas A&M compared the grasslands from the burn sites on site to old growth grasslands off-site but nearby. And she recommended an addition of 5 species, that we reintroduce those to the restoration plots. We had targeted those for the next year. Unfortunately, we did not do any field work really last year, so they're still on our target list for this year. And so we have Texas bush clover, Texas snout bean, and both of these produce just a few seeds per plant. And so we will make a wild collection of those on nearby sites, and we'll be lucky if we can get several hundred seeds for those 2 species. And then we will probably work with volunteers to do a seed increase program, very similar to what the Katy Prairie does with its Great American Grow-Out. So we can start with a greater number of seeds. And then gravel bar bricklebush produces a lot of seeds, so we won't necessarily need to do the seed increase program with that species. So what I'd like for you to think about right now is, how can your chapter use some of the benchmarks for in situ conservation to preserve native plant heritage in the Houston area, or if you're listening from a different area, in your area. And so the 2 that really came to mind from, when I was thinking about my local native plant chapters is to follow the Seeds of Success protocol for common species, to use the Center for Plant Conservation protocol for rare species. And then a great resource that I haven't mentioned so far is the TPWD Wildlife Diversity webinar series. They have already covered some conservation issues with regard to several of our rare plants in Texas. And I think if you watch those, you could get a good idea of what you're trying to do with that. One of them is endemic to Southeast Texas. That's the Texas screw stem. And so you can find that at this URL. And then finally, I think it would be great if each chapter supported the recovery of the native species for their area. If you are in East Texas, focus on those East Texas. If you're out in the Schwallen Desert, focus on those. But if you don't know whether a plant is native to your area, You can always look at the Biota of North America project maps, and they will tell you whether it's native to your area, whether it's been introduced to your area. It will tell you if it's considered to be common or if they're considered to be rare. And so that's a great resource if you were trying to do that. Let's say for the Baptisia that Lynn was speaking about, you could just Google Baptisia Bonap, B-O-N-A-P. I shouldn't have put biota there. That should be Bonap. And it will come up, and you can look to see what counties it's in each area. So that's a real resource for each of the native plant chapters. But what I'd like to do is take a minute to go back in the chat and see if anybody has something that we should address before we go on. All right, let's see. Are the prairie flowers, Texas bluebells, considered rare? I've only seen them here in Huntsville. No, they are, to the best of my knowledge, they are not considered rare. We do not have them naturally occurring on site. I do believe there are areas on site where we probably could get them established. It is one of the reasons that they tend to not, they were not considered by Mrs. Johnson for use along roadways, because our roadways, especially our original roadways, tended to follow ridges. And Texas bluebells, at least in Central Texas, does not follow ridges. It tends to be in the borrow ditches, the margins of ponds, along the creeks where there's full sun. And so even though that was one of her favorite wildflowers, it was not going to be good for most of our roadways. But to the best of my knowledge, it is not rare. Where I will tend to see it in Central Texas will be along roads where sort of an artificial wetland has been created by the construction of the road or the service road or the railroad, and you have an area that stays a little bit wetter for longer. That's why I tend to see it here. I am not sure about East Texas, but if anybody has a sense for East Texas, please feel free to contribute that information. I'm not sure. And then what types of treatments are being done on the research plots? Again, mowing and prescribed fires and control, and mowing and fires are done at different seasons. And then why can't they be treated to remove the invasives? Because what we really want to see is how the different treatments change the abundance of the invasives. And in some cases, we know that a prescribed fire in the summer is going to increase in invasive species. And so what we have to decide moving forward is, what will that look like? Will we continue to have those prescribed fires in the summer when we know that those blue stems are going to actually increase? The good news is we have plans to hire a director of research, hopefully within 6 months. And those are the sorts of questions that director of research can address, and we can decide whether we're going to change that protocol or stick with the original plan. And then the next one, is it true that non-native tropical milkweed has been more successful than native milkweeds in supporting monarch butterflies? If so, what are the reasons other than a longer bloom period? I am probably not the best person to answer that question. I do believe that a lot of it had to do in the very early days. There was just a dearth of seeds for our native milkweed species, and that the tropical milkweed was available. And so it was easier for commercial operators to get that up and running. I am sure that there are many other factors involved with that. Yes, thank you, Google Barnett. And then a bit off subject, but what is the status of plantings along the Texas highways? I'm pretty disappointed by what I see along I-45 to Dallas. I think, again, I probably am not the best person to address that. I will tell you just how I see it from watching Central Texas. When we were doing when we do the vegetation surveys, in any given square meter, it is not at all unusual for us to see 20 to 25 different native species. And I believe that would have been true along MOPAC, the MOPAC right-of-way, before this expansion of the MOPAC. But what will get put in, planted in, seeded in afterward is a mix of 12 species. And so there's no way that that diversity can be replaced. The contours have been changed, and that's to prevent erosion. That's to make it safe for us to drive. There are reasons for that. But for floristic diversity along our highways, it is extremely disappointing. And many of those species that we see in our research plots, we would just not ever be able to harvest them mechanically and get them out there. And so the species that you're seeing seeded in along the highways are those that can be harvested efficiently. And what we have to count on is hopefully our county roads and our other areas to preserve our floristic diversity. It simply is not going to happen along our interstates. All right, anybody else before we go on? All right. I'll sit down so I can see this. All right, back to this. All right, so let's move on to ex situ capacity now. Now, this is what we can do to help the conservation of species that do not naturally occur on site or within the immediate area. First of all, we have a policy that includes a conservation component. Our policy is 28 pages long. I promise you, I'm not going to tell you the whole thing, but it's quite complex. The center prioritizes rare species for off-site activities. We are invited to do a lot of plant rescues and make seed collections off-site. In general, if it is not a rare species, it just won't happen right now. The center also prioritizes rare species for off-site preservation. And so that is when we can actually help keep that rare species preserved where it is. Does not happen very often, but it does happen sometimes. And then the center provides space for conservation activities. So we have a seed lab, we have a herbarium, we have a room that has freezers in it. Those all take space and take money. And then the center tries to maintain genetically diverse germplasm. That's extremely important. And then we provide access to collections. All right, so the collection policy does include a conservation component. The easiest way to learn more about that is that we follow the Center for Plant Conservation guidelines. That is, you already have the URL for that. That is saveplants.org. And then the center restricts use of seeds of rare species really for two purposes: for reintroduction into the wild under appropriate circumstances, and for university level research about the genetics of the plants or the life history or something like that. We don't get too many requests for our rare species, but we do get some. All right, and then we prioritize rare species for off-site activities. This is a good example of a collection that was made This intersection that is shown ahead of that seed collector trying to cross the road had been the site of several accidents, and TxDOT decided to expand and make an actual turn lane there. And it was going to, in the process of doing that, highly impact a rare plant population in that immediate area. That is broadpod nicker, what a name, Plumeria brachycarpa. And so we had a best of all situations. We had someone that worked for TxDOT in that area. She would go out weekly, take pictures of how the plants were doing, whether they were in flower or fruit. And then once we started seeing that seeds were naturally dispersing from those plants, we got 5 people together, we wrote out, and we made a collection. And so you can see what the collection looked like. This is an ice chest, and it's looking down. In the lunch sacks, each contained a plant that had almost mature pods on it, but not quite enough mature. We were just seeing if we could be lucky and have those pods go ahead and mature on the plant. And then each of the coin envelopes there, and I think there were about 58, has fruit from the plants that we just simply could not dig up, but they had ripe fruit on them. And so in this case, this was very different. These plants were just going to disappear. And so we collected all of the ripe fruit from each of the seed parents. And if I remember correctly, there were like 58 seed parents. And we ended up with, I think, about 1,200 seeds from that collection. This was another example. This was one of the craziest things I think I've ever done. But it does show that we have capacity to work with landowners and TPWD and everyone else who would help us. So we prioritize extremely rare species for offsite preservation. In this case, there was a Texas poppy mallow that was the population was going to be impacted by construction. And so the fruit, or you see the plants were still in flower, really couldn't make much of a seed collection at all. So we actually dug up these plants and brought them to the Wildflower Center. I believe there were 48 or 43. We kept them on site for 3 years and we collected seeds. And then that third year, they went back to their area, their native range. There is a refuge for that species in Colorado City. And so that's where they are now. And so that was a really time-intensive project for us. We haven't done anything similar since. We would try to do it if we needed to, but it was something, to say the least. All right, and then the center provides space on site for off-site conservation activities. On the left, you see our seed cabinet where collections come in, the different stages of processing that they're in. We depend upon volunteers for processing those seed collections. And I'm here some of the time and some of the time I'm in the field. And so the volunteers, when they come back on site, they can go to this cabinet, they can look at the data sheets, see where we are, and know what needs to be done next. And then on the right, you see what the actual seed bank looks like. The seed collections have been dried over silica gel and they're put in a moisture-proof sack, and then they're frozen, at a safe. And that just really preserves them for much longer than they could be preserved at room temperature. All right, another example of off-site capacity is that we try, when possible, to maintain genetically diverse germplasm. So this particular rare plant actually occurs in Austin along Lady Bird Lake. And here we see our intrepid seed collectors collecting from a kayak. And but we wouldn't want to go back and collect from that population again. If we were to make another collection, we want to hit a collection where we hadn't made a seed collection. And you can see how important it is to have Mercer, and we work also with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in Louisiana on this particular species because it occurs there. So we're trying to maintain diversity in a given population and then diversity among the populations or across the populations. All right, and then finally, the center provides access to collections to a limited type of user. Usually they're going to be university level research projects, or they're going to be reintroduction projects within the documented range. And so, for instance, if the Nature Conservancy or Parks and Wildlife or someone that has a site that we know is going to be protected for the long run, we would consider a reintroduction project. It requires completing a material transfer agreement for the non-proprietary biological materials. And a lot of people are involved in that. And it's usually something that will take, usually those requests come in at least a semester ahead of time. It's very often a year ahead of time, because somebody is trying to either work on that, research for their thesis or their dissertation. And then what we will do is we won't share the entire collection, but we're going to share 1 or 2 seeds from each seed parent. We're not going to give away the last of those seeds, but we until we can make another collection or we can grow them out. Okay, so how does this relate to NIFSI? Think about how can your chapter use these benchmarks for ex situ conservation to preserve our native plant heritage for future generations. Well, you might not be dealing with, say, rare species, but let's say you're dealing with the bluebells or with the Baptisia. It would involve making your collections locally, so you are working with plants that are adapted to your local situation. We call those ecotypes, rather than, say, purchasing those seeds from an out of state or even out of ecoregion provider. You're going to try to get as close as you can to your site where you are. And the same thing for your prioritized ecotypes for offsite preservation. We can, when we were collecting seeds from Williams Seed Bank, there were many collections of common species that I made at that time in county parks and urban city parks that I thought those populations would be around for a long time. And they have been extirpated, either to build a trail or to, for a variety of reasons, they have disappeared. And so when you have an ecotype that you can make a seed collection for, I think it's a good idea to do it, because you need to build your capacity. You can't wait to build that capacity to the time when you're working on a rare species. And so what I would suggest is try to target a species that you're going to collect, say the Baptisia in the spring or the early summer, and then another one in the fall. I am very lucky right now if I can make 2 seed collections, 2 robust seed collections a year, because I have other responsibilities. But I feel like that's what I have. I have a real commitment to doing that, so we can continue working with our volunteers and landowners that we have engaged with in the past. And then we maintain genetically diverse germplasm. So, for instance, with the milkweed, we want to maintain a collection that was an accession that was made on the Everest Plateau. We want to maintain one from the Blackland Prairie. The same thing for the green milkweed. We don't want those together. We maintain them as separate lines. All right, let me hear back and see if there are any questions related to this. All right. Seeds of rare plants. Should private individuals collect seeds and propagate if that person has access to it, say on their own property? That is a tough question. I believe that what I would suggest for anyone who is going to do that is go to saveplants.org. They have what they call the Rare Plants Academy, and it will give you guidelines for doing that. Not only guidelines for how many seeds to collect, but how to collect them and how to process them so that you are not wasting seeds. And then I would encourage you to let the conservation community know that, because you could let TPWD or the Wildflower Center or the Center for Plant Conservation know. And that would allow us to focus on those species where there are no known collections. So there are many species of greatest conservation need for which there are no seed collections. And so we want to focus our efforts where they're needed the most. But I would strongly suggest you to contact either myself or Anna Strong or Texas Parks and Wildlife or the Center for Plant Conservation. There's a lot of good information out there right now. And then a heard one should not propagate rare plants. The thought is, or one of the thoughts, I'll talk about from the wildflower perspective, is that if we are propagating rare plants from a population that was sort of at a bottleneck, so genetically speaking, it doesn't have a lot of many of the alleles, and we propagate those, the chance that that collection could be used to establish another population is not very good. So we really want to know about the population that we're collecting from and to make that collection so that, to work with that conservation community so that we can use appropriate plants as those seed plants for any reintroductions or introductions. And that's the challenge really for an individual, because that's really a team. Here, we're very good at making seed collections. We don't have the capacity at this time to really look much at the genetics. We have to depend upon other universities or UT, someone on the main campus to do that for us. So it's really a team project, I think is one way to think about it. Yes, and I definitely, in Southeast Texas, contact Anita. She will know what populations have been collected from, and she will know the ones that are still on their target list. And so I think wherever you are, try to contact the person who is local. They will know. And if you don't know who that person is, you can go to the Center for Plant Conservation website, or you can just email them and they can tell you who that person is. All right. Let's see. All right, I would like just briefly, in a short period of time, just to share some of the current research projects that are going on site. First of all, we have ongoing research about responsive grassland to prescribed burns and mowing in different seasons. Again, that's been going on for 20 years. If you visit the Wildflower Center, please take time to go out and look at that. We now have signs up that show what type of treatment each of those plots receives. And then you can just see the difference. When I started working here 15 years ago, It's pretty hard to tell the difference, but you can really tell the difference. You can go to Google Earth and see the difference now. It's amazing. And because of all that research and that ongoing treatment, there are all sorts of other research projects available. There's a project looking at native bee composition as how that it shifts, how it varies between plots. There is a project at the University of Houston about the interactions between plants and soil microbes for two grasses. And right now, I can't remember what they are. They are little blue stem and cytoscroma. And that research is fascinating. It has to do with really climate change and treatments. It's amazing. And then we have a project that will be starting up this summer on soil carbon storage potential in the different plots. All right, so before we go too much further, I want to just sort of do an overview. This is the BONAP map for bluebonnets or the Chinas lupinus. And we can see that there are species of bluebonnets, so to speak, in almost all states, but not all. And so what I want to point out to you here is that just because something is common in one state, it's not necessarily common in another. And what I think Mrs. Johnson would hope would be that in Tennessee and in Missouri, that they would use the plants that were sort of their iconic species and not transport plants that were iconic, say in Texas or Colorado, or California, or Connecticut. And so we're going to focus just for now on our Texas bluebonnets. There are 7 species of bluebonnets in Texas, and all 7 of them are state flower. That kept everybody happy. All right, so we have these 2 species up at the top, and they just occur in the panhandle. And then we have 2 species over on the left corner that just occur in the Shawalin Desert. And then in the bottom right, we have species that occurs sort of along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast and just barely makes it into Southeast Texas. And then in the center, we have 2 species that are common in many parts of Texas, not necessarily always the same parts of Texas. But this is an interesting, we're going to focus right now on the Texas bluebonnet. This is the one that for the most part is spread by the highway department to the tune of tens of thousands of seeds. So that's one we usually see. When we look at the map, the BONAP map for Texas bluebonnet, we see these, in Texas, we see a county distribution map, and we see that we have these counties in which it's shown to be sort of a lime green. And in those counties, it's considered to be naturally occurring there. But when we look at Oklahoma, we see a different shade of green, and it's sort of a teal green. And that means that it was introduced into Oklahoma. So our Texas bluebonnet was introduced into Oklahoma. And so, in my mind, that's a little bit unfortunate because they have their own species of bluebonnets, and ideally, those would be the ones that would be introduced there. If we look at Arkansas, we see one county, and we see that county is shown in yellow, highlighted in yellow, and it is considered a species, a rare species there. And so if we were making a seed collection in Arkansas, we would follow a different protocol than if we were making that collection in Texas or say in Louisiana. So there's a lot of information in those BONAP maps that you can get that can help you very quickly sort of discern, is it native and is common, or is it rare? All right, and then finally, I'd like to talk about big red sage. Big red sage is one of those plants that is extremely rare in the wild. There are people who think that it is extinct in the wild, but it does very well in garden settings. I have seen it in the Houston area. I've seen it in Nacogdoches. I've seen it in Jefferson. And so what I think each of us needs to think about when we're trying to think if we're, with our chapter or with plants, say, if we're a private landowner, what is appropriate? And there are many rare species, and hopefully you can focus on those species that are rare in the ecoregion where you occur or where your land occurs. For instance, my family, we have a family farm up in Northeast Texas. It's been in our family for about 100 years. And eventually I would like to retire up there. It would not be appropriate for me to introduce the big red sage. It would do fine there. It would do fine. But it would, most of its reproduction would be vegetatively. It would not produce seeds. We have hundreds of plants in the wild forests and in the gardens. We're slowly phasing them out, but they do not produce viable seeds. And so that is not in the long term helping the conservation of that species. Is it good for those individual plants? Yes. Is it good for the hummingbirds? And yes, you'll see hummingbirds all over the place. But ideally, if you live in another part of the state, you would focus on those plants that are rare in that part of the state. All right. And then any other questions or comments or suggestions? I am open to them. All right, I do not see any. Okay, Andrew, thank you very much. And I hope that I wish you all luck. I am like you, looking forward to seeing the direction NIPSOT goes with new leadership, and it's an exciting time to be at the Wildflower Center. It's an exciting time to be a member of NIPSOT. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Manette.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Manette. That was great.
Thank you.
And inspire us to go out and collect some seeds too.
I hope so. I hope so.
I might mention we gained somehow 22 members in the first quarter, and I guess there was a contest I wasn't aware of, and we are in the top 3 in the state of all the NIPSOT chapters. So despite not meeting in person and having our famous seed swaps and plant swaps, we still gained 22 members, 2 new members.
Thank you for your support, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And next time, the speaker is John Abbott and his wife, Kendra, and they're going to be speaking about their book, Insects of Texas.
Okay, great.
Go to our website.
Okay, well, good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, and thank you again, Manette.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Good night and thanks.
Good night.